Bill Kayser. Woo, that's great. That's a great start. I'm liking this crowd. I am a software developer with New Relic. I've been with New Relic for about 8 years. I was actually the second person to join that company. When I started, I was working out of a little cafe in Milwaukee. And so I've been with them through the whole period of growth. It's been a crazy ride. But tonight, I'm going to go a little bit further back in history. About 20 years ago, actually, where I was a consultant with IBM. And I was working as a small talk developer for a bank in Texas, and I was bored out of my wits. And then I saw one day this ad in this magazines that I was reading about tall ships. I was always fascinated as a kid with both software development and tall ships. And then I saw this ad that said, "Hey, you like ships? Come sail on board the HMS Rose. You come out for a week and sign on and be a deckhand on a tall ship." And I thought that was awesome, and I went and did it. It was like city slickers for tall ships, and I did it. And ever since I came back, and I went back to IBM, and I was working there, and all I could think about was going on tall ships. And then so 6 months later, I sent the captain a email, and I said, "Hey, how about if I come and work on your ship? I'll volunteer. I'll come out for like a couple of weeks and maybe paint the ship or something." And he goes, "Well, how about if you come out and I'll pay you $125 a week, and we're sailing across the Atlantic to Europe, and you can sign on for 6 months and be a professional deckhand." And I said, "Sign me up." And so fast forward a few months later, and there I am working up in the rig on the tall ship, and it was an incredible experience. And I learned a lot from that experience, and many of the things that I learned, I feel like I could borrow and use in software development, which as my career continued after that. So being a deckhand on a tall ship, basically, it's a pretty heavy-duty job. You go and you stand 8-hour watches. You work 8 hours at a time, 8 hours on, 8 hours off, and you're always working. There's lots of different tasks you do. You steer the ship, you go aloft, set sail, take down sail, or we say set and douse sail. Constant activity, taking in sail. You work aloft on the rig. You're constantly doing things. There's a lot of jobs that you do. I don't know if you can tell from that picture, but that's actually a guy named Tom McCluskey, who's a local software engineer. Anybody know Tom McCluskey by any chance? Okay, there's one person. Yeah, Tom was a sailor on this ship too, but much more hardcore than I was. I'm glad he's not here tonight, so he can shoot me down. But sailors are a pretty hardcore group of people, and it was rough work, but it was also just incredible work. So there were a lot of things from that experience that I learned. A lot of it rooted in the history of tall ships, but a lot of it working from the modern day operations and working with a team of people to achieve a goal. You always have to work together with people to get things done. This is a picture of people, a model's rendering of a capstan where they're walking around this giant winch to raise the anchor, and modern ships, modern tall ships, usually have a capstan of some sort. And on the Rose, on the ship that I was on, we had a capstan. And when we worked on the capstan, this is what it would look like. We'd line up and we'd march around this thing, and it would sort of grumble around and raise the anchor. And it was something we did as a group. And the capstan was also located in the center of the ship, in the waist, right in the middle. And as such, it was also sort of the meeting place at the beginning of every watch. So every watch, people would come gather around the capstan, and we'd talk about the mate of the watch. The leader would say, like, what's the weather looking like that day, what our heading was, any other news going on. We'd kind of meet there, and that's where we'd sort of gather ourselves and prepare ourselves for the day ahead. Every watch starts with a capstan meeting. It was one of the guiding principles there. Now, on tall ships, obviously you have lots of sails and all sorts of things, all sorts of lines and sales and everything that you're constantly interacting with, that you constantly have to communicate to work with people. And here's a picture of us taking in sales. So we take in the sale when the ship's going to go under motor or when the wind kicks up, and here we are furling it, and lots of sales on these ships. You had to sort of constantly be working together and directing everybody on how to guide them. And one of the key components of that was like you had to actually know what all the sails were named. You had to know like when to tell somebody to grab a line, what line you'd say, port side, halyard, downhaul, need hands on that, or whatever it was, shouting out orders. You were always directing people, and we had all kinds of crazy names for things on ships too. There was like, this is the guy working on one of my favorite terms on the ship. He's working on something called baggy wrinkle, okay? I won't even explain what it is, but I just love the name of that. And then you have all these lines, this running rigging, and it was crazy because, you had to know if you were going to like be useful on a ship, you had to be able to look at that pen rail and know what each one of those lines did. And you didn't have time to like look up and trace it through the rig, because if you did, you'd be trying to trace it through something like this. I mean, it was insane. And you would literally, if you were going to be useful on a ship, you had to like pretty much know the function of just about everything numbered in that diagram. And the key component for that, the key thing I learned is you just have to learn the names of everything. And being able to communicate with people on a team to get jobs done, you have to have a terminology that you share, you have to know the words, and you have to be able to use them. And you have to be able to name things. Everything had a name. It was absolutely essential. But at the same time, just knowing the names wasn't enough. There were procedures that had to be done, what they call sail evolution. So if for the ship to even just sort of make a turn, you had to go through this complicated 30-step process where all of the masts and the yards had to rotate in a particular order, and people had to go to lines, and there were different stages, and it could be fairly complicated. And of course, back then, in the time of the Rose, which was 18th century, sailors generally, didn't know how to read. You couldn't just sort of put this in a manual and have everybody reading, and so they had to have a way to sort of transfer this knowledge and have everybody be able to work the ship without, making it overly difficult, and complicating that problem was the fact that at that time everybody in the Royal Navy was given a ration of rum every day. They would call it a tot of rum. So you basically every day people got to have their tot of rum. It was an essential right. It was basically that the life on the ship was just so miserable and horrible. About the only way you could deal with it was to just sort of get them all drunk to at least achieve some sort of level of happiness. And the tot of rum, incidentally, survived in the American Navy all the way up until 1901. They were still handing out rum to sailors in the American Navy in 1901. The Royal Navy, however, it lasted a little bit longer. There was a day known as the Black Tot Day, where they cut off the rum ration. It was July 1st, 1970. So the Brits had a hard time letting go of their rum. So you basically got like this crew full of illiterate drunk people that you're trying to just sort of get them all to work together, and you're trying to teach them whatever way you can, and you basically just had to kind of simplify everything, just sort of dumb it all down to the point where you just had to make it simple enough for a drunk person to be able to do. And this was essential, not just to be able to get things done, but you had people would come on board the ship, leave the ship, and you had to, you're constantly dealing with new people, experienced people, and you just had to have a system that was just so simple that people could pick it up quickly and then you transfer it from ship to ship. And it was absolutely essential to have that simplicity. And so because of that, there was sort of a denigration of kind of innovation. There were no ideas of like, hey, let's make this a little better by introducing this one little, bit to the process. There was none of that. It was just everything was really simple and straightforward, and it made them a very effective. Now, with the trade-off for that was they had this luxury of having lots of manpower. So the modern day HMS Rose that I was on is a replica of a Royal Navy ship, 18th century, and the original ship was a 22-gun frigate, and the modern version, we could sail that ship with probably 12 experienced deckhands, crew, including a mate and a captain, kind of a bare bones crew. The original ship would have had as many as 150 people on board, and this is a very small ship. We could only berth like 50 people on the modern ship. The original ship, with 150 people, it just would have been packed in. But you had this immense wealth of manpower, and so that's what they learned to sort of. All the processes were arranged around. If you just had infinite numbers of hands to do this thing, and you had to make it as simple as possible, how would you do that? So, as you can imagine, on ships, there's a lot of rope. Everything that you deal with constantly as a deckhand is some form of lines or rope, and as such, you're constantly called upon to be able to tie the knots, tie the rope together. You need to know knots, and so there were 3 essential knots that you pretty much had to deal with on a regular basis. The first is what's known as a bend, where you tie 2 lines together. The second was known as a hitch, where you tie a line to something standing, some standing piece of the ship. And this is called that's actually called a clove hitch. This is called a sheet bend, one of the more common bends. And the last one was just a regular knot where you tie a line back onto itself. And anybody know what this is? Bowline, right on. Yeah, this is a bowline knot. It's one of the most common knots, and it was very essential. And you had to be able to just like tie a bowline in an instant. And those 3 knots, but if you knew those 3 and you knew them well, you could get by just 95% of the time, honestly. A lot of the other knots were variations of that, but the key was you had to learn those 3 different types of knots, and you had to learn them really well, and then you'd be fine. So the principle there is learn 3 good knots, as I did. So incidentally, on the Rose, our mission was basically we were a sail training vessel. Every week we'd have people sign on, just like I did when I was working at IBM. They'd come on for a week, and it's city slickers. You get assigned a deckhand, and you work with them, and you learn how to be a crew member on the ship. It wasn't a cruise ship. It was officially the Coast Guard certified to bring on sail trainees. It was a sail training vessel, and there's many sail training vessels around the world today that you can still do this on. And so trainees would come on board, and after a week of working side by side with deckhands, the trainees would learn those knots. They'd learn how to steer the ship. They'd learn how to go aloft, set and furl sail. They'd stand watch. They'd stand a lookout. They'd be able to check the bilges in the ship. And in a lot of cases, by the end of the week, they'd be able to name 80% of the running rigging on the ship. All those pin rails, the trainees could go around and point to each one and tell you what they did, because the system was simplified and straightforward enough that people could really come on and learn it. It was an incredible experience. So there were a lot of people on board the ship, a lot of people working together. You've got people, you've got these sort of deckhands, these sailors that on the original Rose were people who were work on ships all their life. In the modern day tall ships, you have people, usually younger people, who will maybe work for 5-10 years or whatever on tall ships and sort of go through a thing. But there was a real sense of community among the sailors who work on tall ships, and there's a sense of like pride in what they do. There was a sense of like wanting to do things the right way, and it was a really important thing. And people would constantly be learning to do things, not just to get things done, but to really do it well. And so, like, to a trained eye looking at this, a sailor would say, "This looks terrible. This looks terrible. The sails are hanging below the yards. They're not properly stowed up on top of the yard. This is just a haphazard job done by on some tourist boat, whereas like true sailors, the true mariners would look at this and say, this is the right way to do it. You've got to have those sails when you're furling them up tight and high, and they'd pack them in there and they'd pound them on there, and they'd work for hours, and all they do is just be setting sail, and because there was a sense of like, you got to do it the right way. And there was just this real sense of pride about the whole thing. And I came to have a lot of respect for those sailors and on the rows, both men and women. There was this. They had this term that they would say, it's not very seaman-like. Do you want to comport yourself in a seaman-like manner at all times and do things in a very seaman-like way? You wouldn't want to leave coils hung touching the deck. That was atrocious. You'd want to have them nice, neat coils, all looking the same way. And you'd spend a lot. You'd put the coils up there, do it right, do it very rapidly, and then 5 minutes later you'd pull them off the pin rails to do another evolution. It's like, why did you even bother? Well, it's because they had this real great sense of pride in what they do, and it was sort of an artistry in what they did, and it was an essential part of being a sailor, is really take pride in what you do. And then there was also this idea that sailors would come on board the ship. There would get a lot of people who were new to sailing. Some of them had worked on other tall ships, and some of the more experienced ones would come from those ships, and they would bring to them their experience and their knowledge, and bring that experience to the ship. And others would come on board, and all they'd want to do is talk about, like, well, the way we did it on the last ship was we did it like this. On the Gazella, we used to coil and hang from the opposite side that you guys do, or whatever it was. And even though they might be experienced, there was a fine line between bringing your experience on and being just insufferable about what you did on your last ship. And the truth is, nobody gives a shit what you did on your last ship, right? We're not your last ship. So, being on the ship was a lot of fun. I mean, there were great times and just peaceful moments and everything. But there was also a constant, ever-present sense of danger. And we were constantly doing safety drills and constantly preparing ourselves for disaster. You drill and drill and drill every day. Once a week we would have man overboard drills, and you're constantly preparing. But the truth is, you can't really propel yourself for the ultimate disaster, because the truth is, when you see those emergencies, when you encounter those emergencies, it's usually not just one thing going wrong. It's usually not like a person falling overboard in perfect weather, or a yard snapping just with no other circumstances. The truth is, emergencies always happen in threes, and so you can never alleviate, you can never even fully prepare for emergencies. All you can do is learn to sort of mitigate them and deal with them. There was a well-known disaster several years ago. The Bounty sank in Hurricane Sandy a couple of years ago, and they were a very well-prepared crew. I knew several people on that crew, and they drilled, and they were very safety conscious. But at the end of the day, it was the ship that did them in, because it wasn't 1, 2, or 3 things that went wrong. It was just a whole plethora of things that all of a sudden went wrong. And that ship probably could have sailed through the hurricane if it weren't for these constant disasters that happened. So, these are just some of the things that I learned from that experience. And I haven't really talked about software engineering in this talk. And so I'll leave it up for you to sort of draw the parallels. And it's not always that you can look at something like the tradition, the maritime tradition, and immediately, see the parallels with software engineering, which is primarily an innovative activity, whereas the tradition of tall ships and the sea is one of sort of constant, slow tradition and learning, based on centuries of experience. So I'll leave it up to you to decide, how much you would take away from that experience. But I will say one final thing, just with a couple of these pictures that were some of my favorites from that experience, to sort of, for me, capture what it was like at times, where it was just this 1 6-month period of my life where there was, hard work. There was absolutely, no privacy, but there was also just incredible solitude and beauty and everything. And there were times when I would stand on the deck in the middle of the night looking up at the sails above me that were just billowing out, glowing in moonlight like giant pillows. And I'd look down underneath the bow and I would see these dolphins glowing in the phosphorus, playing in the underneath the bow, diving up and down. It was like these missiles, these glowing missiles, and just like nothing around for miles. And it was this incredible experience. And as I would stand there, and it's, miles away from IBM and small talk, and I knew in that moment that this was just like a singular experience that I would never experience again. And I think no matter what you do, whether it's working on a tall ship or even working in a software company, if you look at what you're doing now and the time you're in now, you will never be back at this point again. And the things that we're doing at this time in our lives are really amazing, and that everything will change. It will never be like this again. So now is the time to just sort of take a moment and think about what you're doing, because you'll be looking back on this 10 or 20 years from now, and you'll be thinking about it. And this is the time that you'll be thinking about it. That's my talk. Thank you.